This video is brought to you by CuriosityStream and the 30 free days of documentaries you can get on the link down below. Let me show you one of my favorite new computers I now owned, the new version of the Latte Panda Alpha, an x86 Windows-capable single-board Arduino-compatible computer. This gadget has been floating around tech YouTube for a while, and for good reason. Let's talk about single-board computers for a minute. Thanks to the maker movement and the never-ending stream of hobbyists building projects, as well as engineers and designers that are using popular single-board computers in commercial environments, either as prototyping tools or as components in a final product, we live in an era where you can go from well-known single-board computers like Raspberry Pi, of which I have talked a fair bit on this channel, to boards by many other startups and occasionally large companies trying to get into this game, either competing on price, functionality, or power. One of the angles that is a growing battleground for these new computers is the x86 architecture and Windows compatibility. Most of the single-board computers out there run ARM chips, mainly due to availability and cost. Many companies make ARM chips, and there's a wide variety of tiers and cost levels, and while Microsoft is making progress on Windows 10 ARM Edition and in x86 emulation, this is not even close to being a level required to run something as complex as a game successfully. If you go down the road of trying to have an actual PC or laptop components in a single-board computer, your options are reduced to two companies. You become way more sensitive to component shortages, and your price and power consumption will increase severely. Most of the boards I have seen out there doing x86 try to combat this issue by using older Atom CPUs. The modern Atom SoC line was designed by Intel to provide full PC capabilities with very low power usage, and in that sense, they can be pretty decent. The most powerful Atom out there is the X7 C8750 released back in 2016, which you can find, for example, in the GPT Pocket, and considering how often I end up using this laptop for web browsing and script writing, I will say it definitely accomplishes that mission. However, it has been a while since Intel has released a new upgraded laptop Atom CPU. In fact, while researching this video, I discovered that they made microserver Atoms with like crazy core counts, and I got to get my hands on that. But since their thing is the lowest power consumption possible, they're not exactly gaming ready. Although it can perfectly do games such as PUBG Lite and can do much heavier stuff with a bit of patience, even if it does not look particularly good. Because of their relatively small cost, size and power consumption, Intel Atoms are what power boards like the cheap Atomic Pi, of which I have received a billion requests from viewers to do a video about, but they only ship to the US. Then we have stuff like the original Latte Panda. Both are small x86 single-board PCs powered by Intel Atom X5 C8350, a quad-core CPU similar to the one in the Intel Stick V2, which I tried out for older games years ago, with similar varying degrees of success. Now, what makes things interesting is that Latte Panda, the company that made one of those boards, started a crowdfunding campaign for the Alpha, a new, improved Windows-compatible single-board computer running on an M3 CPU. I have talked about M3 a little bit before. As Intel iterated trying to cover all possible use cases in laptops, they created M3 and M5 CPUs as ultra-low power consumption versions of laptop i3s and i5s. And in that sense, the line seemed like a success, with the core M3 CPUs bringing something closer to true laptop performance, way over what Intel Atoms could do, but with TDPs as low as 5 watts, which makes them ideal for the smallest of laptops. And on that front, they had a great deal of success, most notably showing up in the MacBook in early 2016 and the updated MacBook in mid-2017. The last MacBook was powered by an M37Y32, the same chip promised to be inside the Latte Panda Alpha. So the value proposition was clear, the power of a 2017 MacBook on a very small single-board computer, and what a promise that was. If you have been following this channel for a while, you might have seen the same 7Y32 MacBook CPU before, as it is also in the heart of the GPT-Win 2, the absolutely fantastic handheld gaming device that is my primary platform for playing indie or lighter games, and that I have made a fair amount of content about. And it was the CPU inside the first version of the GPD Pocket 2 laptop, like the one I received, and will be my preferred travel device if the review unit had more than 4 gigs of RAM.
Wait, you have mentioned like 4 computers already that you traveled with. How many laptops do you actually carry around?
More than I should. Going through airport security is always fun. Now the venerable 7Y32 has a problem. It was released in 2017 and that was a while ago. Maybe Intel stopped producing them, but sometime late 2018 everyone seemed to start reporting shortages of this older CPU as GPD updated the Pocket 2 to its successor, the 2018 M38100Y. This shortage also affected the Latte Panda Alpha, which announced the upgrade to the newest M3, with the upgraded board being the one I received, meaning that to my knowledge, most of the boards that you will see floating around on videos before this one are running the older CPU. I managed to get my hands on one of the updated boards thanks to DF Robot, the official distributor for Latte Panda, of which you can find a purchase link in the description. Great, right? Newer CPU means more power and possibly a slightly improved Intel HD, right? Not so fast. There were some unexpected downsides with this change that we should talk about, but we will get there. Now that I have spent a million years talking about CPUs, let's look at the board itself. The Latte Panda Alpha is a comparatively tiny and beautiful device with laptop functionality, but the jump from an Intel Atom means that you also get laptop pricing. At least, if this device claims that it could substitute a desktop PC, it can actually get closer to delivering that with 3 USB 3.0 ports, full HDMI output, an audio jack, gigabit internet, USB Type-C for power, but that can be used for additional displays or USB, a micro SD slot, and all sorts of extra ports for an external battery or touch display. This thing is stacked considering its size. It even includes 2 M.2 slots for extra hard drives or peripherals, or even a PCIe expansion. There are 2 versions of this device for sale with the same specs and ports, with the only difference being an internal memory. So if you get the cheaper one, you will have to rely on something external to store your OS. You might have noticed a large number of I/O pins on the sides. This betrays the actual intended use of this computer, which is being a sort of superpowered maker board for experiments. In fact, under the fan is the same microcontroller found in an Arduino Leonardo, which can be controlled from the Arduino program in Windows. Also under the fan is the newest 8th Gen M3, and when you compare to the older model on paper, it does seem like a great improvement over the older generation in terms of CPU, and at least the same in terms of GPU, if it weren't for the memory. So, the older M3 Latte Panda Alpha sported 8 gigs of dual channel 1867 MHz, and the new one has 8 gigs of 1600 MHz single channel. This is a cut on base speed and going single channel on top of that. Ouch! I will be the first one that points out that a lot of people online, at least in gaming, will overestimate the effect RAM speed will serve on game performance on low-end devices. With one exception. I have talked about this a lot lately after LTX, but on integrated graphics, such as this device, there's no dedicated VRAM and parts of the RAM are used as VRAM. If the RAM is slow, then you can run into performance issues due to memory bandwidth, which will likely be the case for this device. So if later in this video you see game performance that is lower to what you have seen in other videos about the previous version of this device, it is likely going to be this memory bandwidth issue. Now what I believe happened is that when the M37Y30 started becoming difficult to find and they were forced to upgrade, this meant spending more on the CPU, which meant that something had to be reduced to keep the same selling price, and in that sense, I very much understand their decision. If I had been in the position of the engineers when faced with this problem, and it was between using slower single-channel RAM or cutting the RAM to something harder to use like 4 gigs, or cutting some other functionality, the changing RAM seems like the right choice. After all, this is not a gaming intended device and you can get a lot more functionality from maintaining 8 gigs of RAM at all cost. Also, they probably did not have a lot of time to implement this change considering how so many places within the OS still report their wrong CPU. And to be honest, that single channel change is pretty much the only thing I personally did not like about this device, and I'm absolutely in love with everything else that I can do using something so tiny. Which gets me to gaming. It might have not been intended for it, but we're going to try anyway. Before heading there, let's do a few hardware adjustments. predicting performance on any low power consumption chip just based on spec is a nightmare because it will often depend on the configured TDP or its temperature. Often with this sort of gadget, if you're lucky, there will be an option on the BIOS to straight up change the TDP, which means the device will get hotter, but you will get extra performance, as is the case with the GPD Win 2. For the Latte Panda Alpha, such an option is not there, although we do get some options regarding when the fans start and stop, which I imagine will be useful for certain projects, but not as much for us. I will leave it on the one that fires it up faster, since it is really not that loud anyway. However, we get some leeway on increasing performance thanks to the Intel Extreme Tuning utility. This program is often used by overclockers and tweakers to play around with their voltages and clock speeds, and while we do get a reduced set of options on a device like this, we can still do improvements. I am looking in particular at the turbo boost power and time window. Most modern x86 CPUs can boost their clocks temporarily to a higher level as long as temperature and power consumption is kept under control, which is what Intel calls turbo boost. Increasing the time window to the max gets the CPU turbo boosting as long as possible, and increasing the power is a replacement of sorts for increasing TDP, as it increases the TDP that the chip can scale to while boosting, and this makes a huge difference. While the CPU will still not reach its maximum spec speed, it will still boost pretty high. With a problem, it makes the device very hot. This time we have the advantage that this is a table device rather than something you hold with your hands, so we can get a bit crazier than what I will find comfortable on a GPD handheld, but still, the small fan is likely not designed for this sort of head. Which is also why I use the offset to undervolt the CPU a bit. Undervolting can be a bit of a hit or miss process, and it's usually a matter of seeing how much you can drop the voltage and still get a stable computer when stress testing. On this matter, I was able to offset the voltages by about 0.09 volts. 0.1 will mostly work, but will blue screen occasionally in some high stress scenarios. If you decide to undervolt this or any device, keep in mind that every chip will function a bit differently, and do some research before you engage. With these changes, we're ready to roll. And for starters, this machine can be an excellent indie or 2D gaming console with titles like Cuphead working perfectly on 720p and no issues. But let's try something outside the normal range, like 2016's Doom, which is interesting for several reasons. The Intel UHD on this M3 is compatible with Vulkan, so we can make use of its absurd level of optimization, and you can turn off shadows with one console command. While this game is likely very affected by the slow memory, the performance is still pretty good, on lowest settings, 720p, 50% resolution scale and shadows disabled. The game at least maintains 30 FPS at worst, and I'm pushing here as hard as it will go, so this is a fantastic result. Let's look at CSGO, at first using the very heavy benchmarking community map at the lowest settings and a custom resolution of 960 by 540 with a decent average of 53 FPS, which seemed consistent with my experience on actual gameplay, just close to a cool 60 FPS. Keeping the esports vibe going, here is Rocket League, but do not allow this initial performance to fool you. Rocket League is part of several games that tend to continue loading even after the game has started. This is not noticeable on most capable CPUs, but leads to huge spikes of CPU usage that draw the entire performance of a match down until it is finally loaded and the game goes back to normality. Here I'm playing in 720p lowest settings, and while I could not quite reach 60 FPS, the game was fluid enough for an entire match to work and be as fun as always. Now, Fortnite is a bit of a mystery for several reasons. In my experience, Fortnite tends to be decently well optimized for Intel HD GPUs and not particularly CPU heavy, although the large map can cause some bandwidth issues, especially when looking at large parts of it. While performance in general was fine and almost to acceptable levels, there were some issues in loading that consistently caused the game to fail to load full detail assets. While I wish this was something one could control for performance improvements, this seems like either a memory issue or a hard drive issue, which is a bit unusual because the game had never caused issues loading from this specific hard drive before on any other PC. I was not able to exactly diagnose what happened here, so put a pin on this because I will definitely return to this on a later date. GTA 5 was another very interesting case study. While this game is a bit old for modern standards, It has never-ending popularity and still has incredibly demanding system requirements, especially in terms of GPU and VRAM bandwidth, which makes it a fantastic test. For this benchmark, I'm running 720p, 50% resolution scaling, and shadows disabled using the configuration file. And it does much better than I expected. Here's the thing though, I have covered GTA 5 several times in the past, don't watch those, they're terrible, I had no idea what I was doing. And since then, I have realized that I barely talked about the ways you can control the level of detail on this game simply by changing the configuration file, which can lead to some extreme graphical reductions but potentially incredible performance gains in limited environments like this one. Heck, this computer is perfect for that, so I will probably return to this for a more in-depth GTA 5 video in the upcoming months. Before that, a couple of other interesting cases. The first is Wolfenstein 2: The New Colossus. This Vulkan-only game is a heavy shooter, so I tend to use it as a great torture test for integrated GPUs, and at minimum settings, 50% resolution scale and 960 by 540 with shadows disabled, using the console tweaks from its video, it does way better than I expected in an intense combat scene. Hell, I will say it's almost there. The other almost there case, which is interesting to observe, is Overwatch. Overwatch is a very GPU optimized game, but a bit more CPU heavy than many other shooters, and in a controlled training environment with lower settings, it will do just fine. But it had a very obvious stutter that will not go away during any match, no matter the FPS limit that I will set. Well, this is usually a sign of lack of CPU power. I have personally gotten this game working much better on much weaker CPUs, so there is room here for more experimentation and tweaking, which we will get to because, as previously mentioned, these M2 slots have PCI access, meaning that with a simple and cheap adapter, it will be relatively trivial to add an external GPU to this thing, which is why Linus already did it, as well as ETA Prime twice. But both of these were using the older version of the board, which means this one should provide better CPU performance, and a dedicated GPU will be able to sidestep the VRAM memory bandwidth issue. And more importantly, with the correct low-end GPU, it will make for a junky but small and fully capable PC that will probably fit in a hand luggage, making it ideal for a low-spec setup for my next conference LAN party, which is very tempting. But as you might have noticed, this video is getting kinda long, so I will save that for the exciting next part of this saga. Join us soon as I create my next mini LAN party PC, which will be my main machine for those events, for playing Overwatch, maybe some YouTube watching, and of course, enjoying content on CuriosityStream, one of my favorite streaming services and the sponsor of this video. CuriosityStream is a service founded by John Hendricks, the founder of Discovery Channel, that addresses our lifelong quest to learn, explore, and understand by providing some of the best documentaries and non-fiction content I have ever seen from some of the biggest names in science. My recommendation this time is Speed, which is a super interesting look at how the technology of transportation has evolved together with our desire for adventure. I can't remember why I started watching, but it is the sort of thing that once I begin, I could not stop watching for an hour. And yes, CuriosityStream works on browser, phone, TV, etc., so you can get comfy to enjoy its content however you like. They have a selection of free content for you to get started if you're curious, but the complete catalog has over 2,400 videos for less than $3 a month. And you can try for 31 days free if you sign up in curiositystream.com/lowspecgamer and use the code lowspecgamer. Also, that is how they know you heard about them from me, so they can keep supporting the channel, so use the code. Thank you to them for sponsoring this video and you for watching.